it says, after this, many of his disciples turned back and no longer walked with him. And Jesus said to the 12, do you want to go away as well? There are times in life when people who have walked together don't walk together anymore. And we're all aware of that. And it happens in every aspect of life, but it bothers me most, I guess, when it happens in the church. Maybe even more than divorce. I don't know. I just have a really hard time stopping thinking about it. When churches divide, we've had a little experience with that here. Some other places have had it a lot worse. Sometimes brothers leave. Sometimes a group leaves. Sometimes you know it's coming, and sometimes it's a surprise. You didn't see it coming at all. You just hear all kinds of stories. And sometimes even though you kind of felt like it was coming, you don't really know why. And you never really get told why. That's troublesome. Even though they leave, and sometimes they leave together, they don't necessarily stay together. They don't all leave for the same reasons. They don't all go the same places. And it seems to me like every time that happens, some people leave and go to another faith. That's always most shocking to me. That you can sit and sing and praise and believe the same truth that I believe, and then leave it and go somewhere that teaches something else and sing and pray with them and give your money. That's always shocking to me. I think those that leave often claim they're justified in leaving. And those who stay behind feel hurt and feel lost and don't know what to do with it. I think we can realize this, though, that it likely started before anybody was aware of it. On either side. Something started that caused that to happen. And so this happens in our lives. Some brothers that we have loved and worked with and supported and learned from now accuse us of being wrong and leave. But even though they accuse us of being wrong, you almost never see where they will take the time to teach you what they feel you need to know. They just leave. I'm not preaching this because I think there's a problem here, by the way. But I keep seeing it happen in other places. And there could be a problem here, and I wouldn't be aware of it. So that's why I'm doing this. There are complex issues that are underlying what actually happens. Some of those that I thought of are tribalism. Are you here just because this is where you are? Because this is the people you've gone to church? Can you defend why you're here? Or is it just, this is the church I belong to? And when this one makes me mad, I'll belong somewhere else. And there's tribalism on both sides. The people that leave and the people that stay, I think. So we also have a prevalent victim mentality in our country in this time. I was told the other day of a young lady who told her elders when she left that every week she would go and sit in the car and cry after listening to their preacher. As far as I know, he's a faithful preacher. I won't go down that path. I would never come back from that one. There's a me-centered attitude it's in me. I see it. I grew up around it. I hear it all the time on my television and radio, and I'm too worried about what Vernon thinks and what Vernon believes. And then there are desires that we have almost always when you join a group, there's some expectation that you have of joining that group. And if those desires are unfulfilled, then you may decide, well, this isn't the place for me. There are also social and technical developments that have contributed to this problem. Our society is extremely mobile, isn't it? I think in the time that your Bible was written, most towns probably didn't have 5 or 6 churches to choose from. I'm just counting congregation of the Lord's people, not all kinds of churches. Retirement is a fairly recent development. It may not seem so to you, but I think it's mostly happened within the last 100 years. And before that, there was no such thing as retirement. You worked until you were physically incapable of working anymore, and you hoped you had children that would take care of you. And that's just the way life was at that time. So now we have this free time at the end time of our life where we can do as we please. And this one is pretty much just my opinion, but I don't know, maybe you'll agree with me. I think there's a general lack of loyalty. We're so used to change now that we'll just leave anything and go to something else. And you can see that in our marriages. You can see it among siblings. You can see it in business. We're fickle. And so when a person reaches that time of life when they can retire, what do you do when you retire? Well, you go to Florida, obviously. Coincidentally, you're the same age at that time that you should or could be serving as an elder in the church. And instead, there are big buildings in Florida packed full of men that ought to be elders. And instead, they're playing golf. There's this ability to work from anywhere. And I enjoyed it for the last few years of my career. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. But what is there to keep a person where they've been and where they've served and where they're loved and where they're appreciated? Pretty much nothing. We can move and sit down at a computer and do a job for somebody and everything's great except the Lord's Word. And then there's this process that we've been going through of isolating ourselves more and more, where because of social media and all the entertainment that we have streamed into our homes to our computer screens and our televisions, there's just, I have everything I need and I don't need you guys. By the way, I don't really feel that way. But we do live oftentimes in a virtual community more than we do in a literal community. And it doesn't develop the same feelings and loyalties. Suppose for a moment that you had to travel somewhere to work for a few weeks, and you asked Dennis and I, where is there in, I don't know, Atlanta, Georgia, that I can worship? Well, we might come up with a place or two. I know Mary's sister goes to church down in that area. I know there's a congregation called Embry Hills. So I come up with a congregation that's close to where you're going to be, or Dennis does, and we recommend that. Oh, but before you go, you probably should know. Several of the people there have been declaring their allegiance to different teachers. They're kind of choosing up sides over some arguments. You've seen that happening on your social media screens, where a disagreement comes up, and all of a sudden everybody you know is choosing a side. Don't do that. But that's what's going on in that conversation. And also, I guess, they're also kind of tolerating some pretty bad sin. And they're actually kind of proud that they brought some members in that are caught up in this sin. They use the word tolerance and pride a lot. Sounds like our society. And they've been suing each other too. They've been going to court. You know who I'm talking about, probably? They are teaching in that congregation that believing fornication to be the same as fulfilling any other desire. So, committing fornication is no different than going to McDonald's and having lunch. It's the same thing. It's a physical need, and that's all it is. And that some of their people are teaching. Not all of them, but some of them. They have marital problems. Oh, and they've been causing some of their weaker brethren to lose faith. They've been accepting new teachers and respecting the ones that were inspired, or rejecting the ones that were inspired by God. Oh, and some of them are worshiping idols too. They've been assuming roles that are not approved by God. They've even perverted the Lord's Supper a little bit. Well, quite a little bit. They're arguing over who's better. And their worship service is disorderly. I guess probably the worst, though, is some of them are denying the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And they're failing to love each other, and they're not loving God. After we told you all of that, would you go there? You're crazy, right? Nobody in their right mind would go to a church like that. Another thought I had is nobody would want to serve as an elder there either. And I'm sure that most of you are aware by now. I'm talking about a specific congregation in your Bible. The Church of Corinth had every one of those problems. And every one of those problems leads to division in the group. How would you view that congregation? Would you maybe visit there and then write them up on Facebook? It'd be tempting, wouldn't it? My goodness, they still call themselves the Church of Christ. Who can think? They ought to change their sign. I've said that before. But you know what they're never told in the book of 1 Corinthians? They're never told to leave. They're facing every one of those problems in that church, and never in the book does Paul say, pack up and go to East Corinth and go to church over there. Or take the 10 or 12 of you that have got it figured out and go home and start a new church in your living room. He never says that. Or drive to Traders Point and find a congregation that agrees with you. He doesn't say that either. So what were they told? That's what I want to talk about tonight. What were they told? How were they told to handle that? This place is a mess. Well, every chapter has this. And every chapter I have decided in a recent study I've been doing with some members of this congregation, every problem has the same solution. So I could do about 4 hours on this, but I'm not going to. I picked a handful, and we're going to talk about those. Chapter 1, I just want to talk about it first. You probably remember from the classes that you've attended on 1 Corinthians that they started out by talking about there's division in the church. And that's where it starts, right? Some kind of division over some kind of problem, and then things go to pot, and it all falls apart, and the Lord is dishonored because of it. And it says that some of them were saying, I follow Paul, and some of them were saying, well, I follow Apollos, and some of us were saying, I follow Cephas. Why would they do that? What is the point of me coming to you and saying, I'm a Ken Flays fan? What would be the point? And you say, well, I really like Dan Starr. He's my kind of preacher. What's the point of that? I think probably, especially in the time of the apostles, there had to be a little bit of, I was baptized by Paul, or I was taught by Paul. So when you and I have a disagreement, would that carry a little weight maybe? As a matter of fact, I traveled with Paul a little bit. I know some stuff about him, so maybe that gives us a better sense of self. And we're not going to get into the details of the scripture. We don't have time tonight. But the answer was, there's only one team, and the team isn't Paul. It's Team Jesus Christ. He's the one that died for you. Wouldn't that fix just a whole bunch of our disloyalty problems if we would just all sit back and think when we're brewing over these kind of things, yeah, it's about Jesus. It's not about me. It's not about who you are. He even says in that chapter, it's not because you were so wise or so, what did he say? Powerful or of noble birth. It's not because you're good looking that you're here. I'm adding my own now. It's not because you used to go to a mega church. It's not any of those things. You are here because you need salvation. So it's not about who you are. And he says in verse 30 and 31 of chapter 1, Jesus Christ became wisdom, righteousness, sanctification, and redemption. So if you want to brag about something, brag about being loyal to him because he became what you needed, and you don't have the ability to do it anyway. There's a consistent message, I believe, in every one of these problems all the way through the book. In one form or another, he answers them. It's not about you. And I think when division happens in the churches, it's because we're looking at self. As a matter of fact, I'll just go ahead and let you in on a little decision I made towards the end of this study. I believe every time we get involved in sin, it's about self. Why does a person get involved in adultery? I'm thinking about myself. Why does a person get drunk? I want to feel better. I think every sin is related to that problem. So the consistent answer is, it's not about you. Every solution for a problem in Corinth had some form of that answer. It is not about me. So let's turn over to chapter 8. We're going to look quickly at chapter 8, 9, and 10. And if you're in my Bible class, that probably scared you to death, didn't it? 3 chapters. Let's see what we can do. So apparently Paul had received this list of questions from the people in Corinth, and they want to know what he thought, what his position was on these things. And you have to kind of pick them out on your own, because we're not given the list. You just pick it out by his terminology. He says in verse 1, now concerning the food offered to idols, we know such and such. And so apparently that's one of the questions he asked, or they asked. Something to do with food offered to idols, which I think we can relate to. Most of us have friends that we have helped bring into the Lord's body from other faiths. And they have things that they have to give up or take on. And so they have to leave some things behind, don't they? And so there's this struggle then of what can I do that they used to do. You know, used to go to church where they had a band. So can I listen at home to gospel music with a band on the stereo? Can I do that or not? You see how that's a question? Well, if you have been involved in the worship of idols, you know then that at the idols' temples, similar to the worship of the Lord in the Old Testament, they would bring animal sacrifices. And those animals would be killed and certain parts of it would be burned up. And then they would have this feast together. And that was part of the worship. It's kind of like part of our worship, isn't it? We have a meal together every Sunday morning. We'll get back to that in chapter 10. Paul says right off the bat, you can eat meat offered to idols, or you can't eat meat offered to idols. It doesn't. Now, he doesn't give them that answer at all. As a matter of fact, he doesn't answer their question in chapter 8. He's going to talk a whole bunch about it, but he's not going to answer their question. And he's not going to answer it in chapter 9, where he's going to go to another topic. And finally, in chapter 10, he'll give them the answer to whether they can eat the food or not. I don't know. I wondered if Paul took a little perverse pleasure in that. And you'll see why I think that as we go through the answer. But he says right off the bat, now concerning the food offered to idols, we know that all of us possess knowledge. This knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. If anyone imagines that he knows something, he does not yet know as he ought to know, but if anyone loves God, he is known of God. Okay, so you ever ask somebody a question and they just start talking about something else? It's not even what you ask. That's what it feels to me like Paul did. Oh, so you think you've got knowledge? Well, we all have knowledge, and knowledge does what? He said it makes us arrogant. If you take this out of context, it makes very little sense at all. But if you think about it in the context of a division that's happening in the church. I remembered an incident years and years ago where we were discussing a problem with another couple, Susan and I were. And this other lady said to us, when you've studied it as much as we've studied it, you'll understand. And that's stuck in my craw ever since then. That's the attitude that's displayed in this chapter. I'm not arguing there's no such thing as right and wrong. But there is an attitude of, I've got this figured out and you don't. And that's where they were. And Paul is saying, you've got knowledge. Well, what's the knowledge that they have? He tells us. He says, therefore, as to the eating of food offered to idols, we know that an idol has no real existence. So you're going to argue about whether or not to eat food offered to idols. And these people are saying, an idol is nothing. It's a chunk of wood that they carved to look like a turtle. And they worship it. That's nothing. So why would it matter if I ate food that was offered to the wooden turtle? Doesn't make any sense, does it? And that there is no God but one. We know there's only one God, so I can eat any meat I want to. For although there may be so-called gods in heaven or earth, as indeed there are many gods and many lords, yet for us there's just one God and there's just one Lord. I'm starting to think I agree with these people. How about you? Their logic is flawless as nearly as I can tell. It's just a wooden turtle. It's just a silver image. It's just a golden calf, right? What difference would it make if I ate meat that was offered to it? So I can eat, right? Seems okay. Look at verse 7 in chapter 8. However, not all possess this knowledge. He goes on to talk about that. And when you think about that, that's perfectly logical. The guy that used to worship at the temple to Diana, and now you've brought him to the Lord, and just a few weeks ago he was baptized, has realized in his mind, this is different. And this is our meal, and I can't be a part of that meal anymore, right? You see how he would think that? Whether or not that's a real God. It's been a real God to him his whole life. Maybe he was raised in that temple. And it's going to be difficult for him to overcome the fact that that's not even a real thing. So it's hard for him. And he says then, in verse 10, so he sees you eating in the temple of the idol. I think maybe we have to kind of put ourselves in their position. I don't think they had McDonald's then. And I think the equivalent of grabbing a meal was to go to one of the idol's temples. Because there were always feasts going on there. There were always people there eating their sacrifices. And you could share in that. And it's just me grabbing an idol. That idol doesn't mean anything to me. Or grabbing some food. What wasn't eaten in those feasts was sold in the marketplace. So even if you went to the vendors on the street that sold meat, you were likely buying meat that had come from the temple to Diana. So you see where the question was just all over the place for them. And these Christians had reasoned within their mind, I can do whatever I want. But listen to what Paul says then. Once the weak brother who doesn't understand sees you eating there. If anyone sees you who have knowledge, that was a dig, wasn't it? Eating in an idol's temple, will he not be encouraged, if his conscience is weak, to eat food offered to idols? You know the guy gave up that religion last month and came over here to follow Christ. And he still feels like he just shouldn't go over there. But then he sees me going over there and said, maybe Dennis and I go over there and have lunch together. And all of a sudden he's thinking, maybe it doesn't really matter what I do. Maybe I can do both. I just had somebody ask me recently, can I be a Christian and a Catholic too? So by your knowledge, the weak person is destroyed. What does it mean he's destroyed? I didn't do anything to him. And the person who is destroyed, this is how he's described. The brother for whom Christ died. Ooh, this sounds serious now, doesn't it? This is somebody that Christ died for and brought him out of that idol worship, and now I'm tempting him to go back to it. So no, you can't do that. Thus, sinning against your brother, wounding their conscience when it's weak, you sin against Christ. Therefore, if food makes my brother stumble, I will never eat meat again, lest I cause my brother to stumble. So the guy that's the weak one, the one that ought to know, he should just learn. And then he would know that the Princess Diana, or the Princess Diana, the idol Diana doesn't mean anything, different character. But he's encouraged to eat the food, even though it's against his conscience. So he violates his own conscience. And he's the one that Christ died for. And he's destroyed, and he stumbles. That sounds bad enough. But what he says about the strong Christian, which one are you, the weak or the strong? Neither. Most of us think we're the strong. I'll just go there for you. That's what we think. We think we've figured it out now, so we're the strong. And it says we have destroyed a weaker brother, and we have sinned against Christ by sinning against our brother. Whew. That's serious stuff. And he still hasn't told him whether it's right or wrong. He just says, you should have been able to figure this out. You should have known not to do it. What he's done is he's placed love above knowledge. It's not okay for me to have all the answers about the Bible and to destroy you and chase you off from the Lord's body with my knowledge. I need to be more careful how I treat you. So what's the implication? If your attitude was right, you wouldn't have sinned. You wouldn't have sinned against your brother, and you wouldn't have sinned against Christ. It's not all about you. It's not about whether you're allowed to have meat from the idols or not. Paul goes on then in chapter 9 and says, we also have rights. It kind of feels like he changes subjects, but really he's not. He's staying right on the same subject. He's just using himself and the other apostles as an example. And he says, we've got the right to eat. We've got the right to drink. We've got the right to take around a believing wife with us. We have all these rights. And one of our rights is to be paid for what we're doing. We have the right to do that. And he gives several proofs of that. The first one is a logical set of proofs. Look, you wouldn't expect a soldier to pay his own expenses. You wouldn't expect a guy that dresses the vineyards to go out and buy grapes, would you? Surely he gets some of the grapes. And the guy that's the shepherd, he doesn't buy milk. He gets some of the milk from the sheep. And so he says it's just logical. A person doing a work ought to get paid for it. He also says that it's lawful. In the Old Testament it says you can't muzzle an ox while he's treading out the wheat. And then it says, do you think the Lord was concerned about the ox? No, he's using that to teach you that if you're the guy working in the Lord's work, you should be able to get paid for it. And then he says, not only that, it's commanded by the Lord later in the chapter. But look at verse 12b in chapter 9, the last half of verse 12. Nevertheless, we've not made use of this right, but we endure anything rather than put an obstacle in the way of Christ, of the gospel of Christ. I'll have to word that. So, he has the right to collect pay from them, but he felt like that might be an obstacle to the churches in new and weak places. And that's the same way it is today, by the way. When churches are planted in Colombia, those guys that start out preaching there, they don't generally get paid by the people. If they do, they get very little. And he did that because he would rather endure anything. He'd rather be hungry. He'd rather go without pay than to see the church damaged. You see an attitude that we ought to have about the church. And he says, I do it all for the sake of the gospel. What's he saying? I've got rights, but it's not about me. It's not about you, and it's not about me. So take a look at chapter 10. Probably we don't even need the answer now because idolatry is not a problem for us, right? There's no idols to Diana, no temples to Diana here in town. I don't see people praying to little wooden carved images. That's just not a thing anymore, so we really don't need it. Take a look at chapter 10, beginning in verse 7. These things I'm actually starting in verse 6. These things took place as an example for us that we might not desire evil as they did. Do not be idolaters, as some of them were, as it's written. Now listen to how you can become an idolater. The people sat down to eat and rose up to play. You remember that event? That's at the giving of the 10 Commandments when they're waiting at the bottom of the mountain. And they began to do what they wanted to do, and they played and danced, and there's a sexual implication to what was going on down there. They were just doing riotous living. And he said, that's idolatry. We must not indulge in sexual immorality, as some of them did. And 23,000 fell in a single day. That's from Numbers 25. You can read that story of when they went back to the idol Baal to do what they wanted to do, and thousands of them died. He says then, we must not put Christ to the test, as some of them did. They didn't trust in the Lord's provision when they were wandering in the wilderness. And that's called idolatry. When God says, I'll provide, and we don't trust that, and we turn to some other means of provision, we are idol worshipers. And then, this one really doesn't make sense to me. Nor grumble, as some of them did, and were destroyed by the destroyer. Do you ever think when you're grumbling about something that you are committing idolatry? That one was a bit of a puzzle for me. It took a little looking at that to think about it. Hebrews 13:15 says about our worship of God, through him let us continually offer up a sacrifice of praise to God. That is the fruit of lips that acknowledge his name. When we come in here on Sunday morning and we surround this table and we profess our belief in Jesus Christ and his death and his resurrection and that he's coming back to get us again, we are offering up praise to him by saying the truths that he gave to us with our own lips. When we grumble about what goes on in here, we're using the same lips to speak for the other side. And we're committing idolatry, according to the scripture. So he finally answers them in this chapter. And the answer is no. You can't go down to the temple of Diana and sit down there and eat in that restaurant or festival room or fiesta or whatever you want to call it. You can't do that. You can't partake of the table of the Lord and the table of demons. And this is the logic he uses. He says, when the people in the Old Testament brought their sacrifices to the priests and they offered that sacrifice and then they ate the feast, were they worshiping? Duh. Yeah, they were worshiping. And when we surround this table and we eat the bread and we drink the fruit of the vine, are we worshiping? Yes. And when you go sit at the base of the idol Diana and eat the feast with all of those good brothers and sisters over there, you're worshiping demons, he said. So no, you can't do that. It's not about me. That's the point, right? It's not about me. It's about doing what's right for the Lord. It's about doing what's right for my brothers and sisters. So what's the point? What if I'm right? What if we're having a disagreement and I'm right? Or the term we use more often today, are you scripturally correct? We say that, don't we? I don't think that's scriptural when somebody says something we disagree with. Well, I have knowledge. But in that first chapter we looked at, chapter 8, it talked about loving your brother and being careful about him. Why did he start there? Why did he not go straight to the right or the wrong of it? That's what we always want to know, right? We want the black and white, right or wrong. Why did he talk about love? What's the greatest commandment? Anybody know? Love God. What's the second greatest? Love your neighbor. Huh. The greatest things we can do are to love God and love our neighbor. And so that's where he started with the argument. There's a right and wrong to it. But I think he's kind of showing us that sometimes we may not be ready to figure out the right or wrong of it. And honestly, I think we have to make decisions in this life that we may never be 100% sure that we're right. But we can always go down that trail, can't we? Is this going to destroy my brothers and sisters? Is it showing love and respect for the Lord? And that honors the first two commandments. Love God and love your neighbor. So when that division takes place in the church, and I decide I have to leave, is that honoring God? Is that honoring my brothers and sisters? Disagreements often start over things that we believe we have the right to do. I've been observing that a lot recently in congregations that have had this problem. I believe that we have the right to build an orphanage. That's the old standard, right? That's the one we've been badgering around for years. There are all kinds of new versions of that discussion. And we can do it with the Lord's money. In every congregation that they had that battle, the church blew apart. And if you'll just forgive me for the moment, for the sake of clarity, I'll use the labels. Then we had the liberal group and the antis, right? If you didn't know those terms, that's what that means. And you don't hear as much as you used to, but you do still hear it. It's still around. First of all, we ought to be calling each other brothers and sisters. And we ought to be figuring out, is there a way for us to do the work that the Lord tells us to do and not violate anybody's conscience? Because if we can, then that's what we ought to be doing. Question came up recently. Can one of the ladies here operate the computer? And so there was some discussion about that. And some people shared their opinions with Dennis and I. And you know what we decided? It doesn't have to be a girl, and it's going to cause trouble if we put a girl back there for some people with their conscience. So we're not going to do it. The job's still getting done. Good job, Gabriel. And we didn't violate any of the Lord's commands. Would it violate the Lord's commands if we put a girl back there? You don't need the answer, do you? Just read chapter 8. You need to think about each other and be nice to one another. And so, it's not about me. It's not about what I want. It's about the good of the Lord's church. And it's never just about me. When people leave, they act like, I'm just going somewhere else. I'm not doing anything to anybody. Have you ever seen a situation where that was true? That's not true. Somebody is always hurt. There's pain left behind. The church is damaged, and the church is the bride of Christ. And I don't know what to say to make it any plainer than that. If you're willing to damage the bride of Christ, there's something stinking about your attitude. And then the scripture also talks about, don't let a root of bitterness spring up. What better words could you use to describe the relationship between congregations of the Lord's people today than a root of bitterness? We have run over people's feelings, and I mean the royal we, not you and I. But we could be. And every time that happens, almost every time, I can't say that with certainty, almost every time, somebody leaves the Lord. They don't just go to another congregation. They're so weak in their faith or new in their Christianity or whatever that they just flat give up. And they end up either not going at all or going to some organization that's based on another gospel. And we know that's not right according to the Bible. Maybe they go to the temple of demons. So how do we deal with differences when it's, we're not talking about thou shalt not kill, right? I'm not saying there's any judgment involved. That's pretty plain in the scripture. It's pretty plain you have to be baptized for remission of sins. We're not talking about those kind of discussions. We're talking about things that we have to make decisions. And here's my 2 cents worth on that. I think that's why the Lord gave us elders. Somebody's got to make a decision, and somebody's got to take the heat. And right now, that's Dennis and I. And he says you ought to obey your elders. If we start teaching you don't have to be baptized to be saved, then don't follow us and leave. Go somewhere or change our minds. But we're not talking about those kind of things. And I've never seen a situation where people leave over those kind of things. Not in the Lord's body. We leave over opinions. Our knowledge. Ken gave us a really good lesson this morning about you ought to be praying, you ought to be reading your Bible. You need to soak up everything you can get of what the Lord wants you to do. Soak it up, make it part of your life. But don't become arrogant. My dad said that when he was young, they made him an elder, and he knew all the answers. And when he was older and he wasn't an elder anymore, he knew he didn't know the answers. Open your Bible back to 1 Corinthians 8. I want you to look at that. 1 Corinthians chapter 8. Verse 2. I love this verse. If anyone imagines that he knows something, he does not yet know as he ought to know. When you think you know something, be careful. You don't know half as much as you think you know. My knowledge especially shouldn't cause somebody else to sin. If my knowledge chases you off, because I'm so sure that I'm right. But we're still stuck with this. Our actions need to match our beliefs. And I think you can show that over. You remember Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? And the king said, you got to bow down to this idol. And if you don't, we're going to kill you. Couldn't they have argued like the Corinthians did? Well, it's not really a god. It's just an image. It's nothing, right? So, I can bow down to a car. It ain't got anything to do with my worship of God. That's not the way the story went, is it? It matters because people are watching you. and you are limiting other people's opportunities to learn about God. Everyone sees you worshiping the idol. So the bottom line is it's not about me. And my last thought on this comes from when I was probably 4 or 5 years old. I don't know if we still use the song, but in our kids' classes back then, we learned to sing, Jesus first, myself last, and others in between. If we don't sing that song, we ought to find it and bring it back for our kids. That's the truth of this. If I get myself in the number one spot, then it all goes haywire, right? It's Jesus first. And that's what the whole book of Corinthians is telling you. It's about Jesus. It's not about you. So it's Jesus first. It's your brothers and sisters second. And then you can talk about what color carpet you want in the building. And if we use that for every decision we make, and I use that somewhat tongue-in-cheek, there are more important decisions than that we make. But we need to be careful how we make decisions and how our decisions affect other people. I hope division doesn't come to this congregation. But if it does, go home and read Corinthians and decide where you're going to be in that picture. And so the question for you tonight is Jesus first in your life? Whether it's time for you to make him first in your life for the first time, or it's time for you to pick him up and dust him off and put him back on that throne in your heart. Take care of that tonight as we stand and sing.
Would you be free from your burden of sin? There's power in the blood, power in the blood. Would you or evil a victory win? There's wonderful power in the blood. There is power, power, wonder-working power in the blood of the Lamb. There is power, power, wonder-working power in the precious blood of the Lamb. Would you be free from your passion and pride? There's power in the blood, power in the blood. Come for a cleansing to Calvary's side. There's wonderful power in the blood. There is power, power, wonder-working power in the blood of the Lamb. There is power, power, wonder-working power in the precious blood of the Lamb. Would you do service for Jesus your King? There's power in the blood, power in the blood. Would you live daily his praises to sing? There's wonderful power in the blood. There is power, power, wonder-working power in the blood of the Lamb. There is power, power, wonder-working power in the precious blood of the Lamb.
For those of you who were unable to partake of the Lord's Supper this morning, we will sing When I Survey the Wondrous Cross. And at any point during that song, you can make your way to the front, and you'll be served there after. If you would be seated. When I survey the wondrous cross.
When I survey the wondrous cross on which the Prince of Son